right, so I'm Dawn Hawkins. I'm the CEO at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Welcome to this virtual congressional briefing. We're talking about how the Earn It Act protects children from rampant child sexual abuse on tech platforms. And I wouldn't be surprised if you've heard nothing positive about the Earn It Act, a bill designed to confront the explosion of child sexual abuse material, or CSAM, online. A quick Google search yields results that make the bill sound like a threat to humanity. Good news about this bill is conveniently buried, I'm convinced, because this bipartisan solution is a threat to big tech's laissez-faire attitude towards confronting the sexual abuse and exploitation thriving on social media and other digital platforms right now. The Earn It Act was reintroduced in the US Senate by Senators Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham, and was introduced in the US House of Representatives by Representatives Sylvia Garcia and Ann Wagner. The Earn It Act will inspire big tech accountability for the rampant distribution of CSAM. The bill has precise goals. The Earn It Act does specifically three key things. Number one, it clarifies congressional intent regarding social media and technology companies that knowingly facilitate the distribution of child sexual abuse material on their platforms. They should have no legal immunity, as some courts have mistakenly interpreted the Communications Decency Act in the CSAM context. Number two, the Earn It Act updates existing federal statutes to use the term child sexual abuse material, or CSAM, instead of child pornography. Child pornography is a term that fails to describe the true nature of the images. They're crime scene documents. And number three, the Earn It Act establishes an advisory commission of survivors, technology representatives, and government stakeholders to create recommendations and voluntary best practices for tech companies to respond to the global pandemic of online exploitation of children. The reality is that we've waited since the dawn of the internet age for tech companies to protect children online. They have not stepped up. And this problem has only increased. As our youth were pushed online during COVID, reports of CSAM have skyrocketed. As you'll hear today from Yiota, Souras, Senior Vice President of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, most of us know a child who has been harmed because of the design flaws created by these platforms. And tech's response is to barely even acknowledge that there's a problem. Tech companies have the capability to reduce sexual exploitation, and they can eliminate child sexual abuse materials, as Berkeley professor Hany Farid will explain today. What's especially cynical is this, though. Big tech cannot say, we want the right to allow CSAM to fly free on our platforms, thereby putting more children at risk for rape and torture. Instead, they are spreading disinformation and confusion about privacy and encryption, which this bill does nothing to undermine. What about the privacy of a child who was raped, her abuse was recorded, and that abuse is circulating infinitely worldwide forever? Because that's the status quo today. We have assembled two panels of subject matter experts from around the country to explain first why the Earn It Act is needed, and second, what solutions it proposes. Panel one, the reality and harm of victims to CSAM and how rampant it is on the internet. We will hear from Glen. He's the Chief Operating Officer of Child Rescue Coalition. CRC has developed technology solutions to help law enforcement identify criminals trading CSAM files. Glen's background is in operations at the United Kingdom Serious Organized Crimes Agency. Followed by Glen, we'll have Jane Doe. Jane is a mother whose 13-year-old son thought he was talking to a 16-year-old girl who asked for intimate images of the boy on Snapchat. 2 years later, those images were now a film posted on Twitter. But Twitter told the family that this CSAM of their son, quote, did not violate Twitter's community standards. Carrie Jenkins is a clinical and forensic team supervisor at the Norton Child Advocacy Center in South Carolina, and she's an advisor to the National Children's Alliance. And Anthony Zarkness teaches at Columbia University's School of Social Work, the nation's first social work school. He's an expert on the impact of trauma on victims of sexual violence. Glen, you will lead us, and Glen is gonna lead with a macro picture of the reality of child rape and torture images being traded on the internet Thanks, Glen.
Thank you, and thanks for all of you attending today or watching this recording. This, guys, unfortunately, is the reality of child sexual abuse material being shared in unregulated spaces on the internet. We're able to track that material, millions of files a day, and then make technology that we give free to law enforcement to allow them to identify and arrest child sexual abuse suspects. You'll hear later from our friends at the National Center from NCMEC. That's not what you're looking at here. So the number of reports to NCMEC are increasing, but that's completely and wholly separate from what you're looking at on your screen. And when we talk about CSAM, I think we all need to know and understand what that means. Is child sexual abuse material relating to very young children. I believe that some people read the words child and pornography, as we often see it still in the news, and they believe somehow that it might be an adult dressed as a child. That's not the case. Some of the files that we are seeing on a daily basis involve not just very young children under the age of 12, but toddlers and even babies being sexually abused, some of them being raped. The material is horrific. The images are horrific, and the videos, more often than not, are horrific. The sounds on these videos are something I hope none of you will ever hear in your lives, but it's something that law enforcement is seeing every single day. So we know that child sexual exploitation is not a new problem. It's been going on since the dawn of time, but the internet and internet-connected devices has changed how this happens and how it can be identified. When I was in law enforcement back in the 90s, a VHS tape was one of the ways that we would identify CSAM arriving into the UK. And then we'd try and identify the people behind making that tape of this horrific abuse material. As we know, the technology has moved on exponentially in those 3 decades, but the legislation has stayed the same. When I was 12 and I got home, my parents knew I was safe once I was in my bedroom. Nowadays, arguably, it's when a child is at their highest risk if they have an internet-connected device in their bedroom with them. Which other child predator is in there with them via the popular games and apps? You've already heard one of them mentioned today. Multi-billion-dollar companies have the most amazing resources. We use all of their technology ourselves, the most amazing devices, and the most amazing data about all of us. But the technology is making it possible for criminals to directly connect with and groom children online, whether via this online grooming or abuse which has taken place in the child's home. Tech companies' devices are being used to record this horrific crime. Tech companies' servers are being used to store this CSAM. And tech companies' platforms are being used to share it. Criminals are congregating online in their tens of thousands. They celebrate the abuse and rape of children, and they're telling themselves that it's okay, and even that children enjoy being raped. They're trying to normalize the abuse of children. EarnIt creates a way to work with the tech companies to help them identify the worst offenders on their platforms and to make CSAM less accessible than it is today. It's the help that law enforcement deserve. It's really the least that survivors of this terrible crime deserve. Safety technology is available. Safety data is available. And that means we can have, through the EarnIt Act, the privacy we all deserve and crave, and the safety that children deserve. I hope you will help us with this endeavor, and I hope you will enjoy listening to the other panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you, Glen. We're now joined by Jane Doe. She's a wife, a mother, and a healthcare worker from Central Florida. She's joining to share her story and the story of her son. To protect their family's privacy, Jane Doe is sharing a true story, which is the subject of federal litigation. She's joining us anonymously. She'll give us a personal account of what it means for a family to suffer twice, first through online sexual exploitation of a child, and then through a platform's knowing refusal to remove the CSAM. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. I'm not a professional speaker, so I can't promise not to cry. But Glen said something very significant. My husband and I are both nurses. We both spent our lives, my husband working nights and I working days, so that our children would never ride a bus or never go to daycare, to never be at the hands of a predator. And my son was victimized in his own bedroom on his iPhone through Snapchat. And, you know, we later found out that he was 13, as you had said earlier, thinking that he was talking to a 16-year-old girl. How we became known of the situation was I got a phone call from just an acquaintance that her niece, had told her that my son was in his room, and he was telling her that he was suicidal and that he wanted to kill himself due to the material that had been floating around school and the kids were passing around. So we became aware of this situation. We never knew that this happened to my son when he was 13. And when he was 16 going into 17, we found out about this the night that he was suicidal. Basically, a predator took multiple Snapchat videos and put them together to make one video, and it surfaced online. On day 2 of us being aware of it, there had been 167,000 views, and it had been up, for at least several days before we became aware of it. The really difficult thing was we were lost. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to get it offline. After our third local law enforcement agency basically saying that this was sexting, and that did I really want to pursue this because our child could potentially be held with a felony because he was passing nude videos or pictures back, and did I really want to push forward with this? So we became paralyzed and not quite sure what to do, completely lost, didn't know where to turn. All I knew is we needed to get it offline. I reached out to Twitter. We filled out several forms online for child exploitation, that it needed to be taken down. Through the several struggles of it not coming down, I reached out to my local pastor, and I just said, we are just completely lost and I don't know what to do. Everybody promised to get it down and nothing was happening. My pastor put us in contact only, with us praying and just begging God to give us an answer, because we didn't know what the answer was. My son we met with this federal agent that was local, but was Homeland Security. He listened to my son and asked the story, and he looked him dead in the eyes. And, as sad as it was the best thing he could say, that, this is not your fault. And this is classic. You're a victim of a child trafficking situation. So then after the federal agent had it, so we basically had going back and forth with Twitter, and the most mind-blowing situation, or the thing was that Twitter in writing said we have viewed the material and this does not break our policies, and then carried on for us to give us instructions to fill out other forms. So the federal agent had it in his possession day 9. And at day 2, it had the 167,000 views. I had other children calling me, older children. Then my son, saying their friends were seeing this. We were humiliated, scared. My son was at the verge of being suicidal and just completely lost. So by the grace of God, we're blessed to have this federal agent fighting for us, and was able to get it down and dismantle the thread after day 9. But even in his hands, that's how long it took for it to come down. So I, as a parent, don't understand. I don't understand how children can stay up online. I mean, a predator molesting a child is is against the law. It's not okay. And how is it okay for tech companies to say, well, we viewed the material and it doesn't break our policies? This is mind blowing to me. And I didn't know this was going on until it happened to us. And people need to know this is going on. Parents need to know that it's going on in their own homes. And we need the EARN Act, because our children need the EARN Act, and we need to fight to protect them. I want to be a part of anything I can do so that this never happens to another child again.
Thank you, Jane Doe. Thank you for your courage and your determination to prevent this crime from happening to other children. It's happened in my family too, similar stories, and it's not fair. And the EARN Act would help so many children. Across the nation, children's advocacy centers are the first line of treatment for child victims of sexual violence. Carrie Jenkins will share what CACs are seeing and how they help young survivors.
I just want to echo John's thanks to Jane Doe for sharing that story. I'm sad that that's not the first time I've heard a story like that. In fact, that's an unfortunate reality that we hear a lot. So as Dawn said, children's advocacy centers are, for those who don't know, a place for children to share their account of abuse that has happened to them and the first step toward healing. I've had the honor and privilege for my entire career of walking alongside these children as they heal. And I'd like to tell one child's story. So this child was 10 when I met her, and she was having severe PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress symptoms related to sexual abuse she had experienced by a family member, and that sexual abuse had been documented by that family member through photographs. We worked diligently. She was brave and courageous, and sometimes saddened by the work we were having to do, but she was able to get to a place where she was empowered over her memories of that abuse, and really significantly reduced those post-traumatic stress symptoms, went on to engage beautifully in high school. And I got a call 4 years later. She was now 14. And the family said, we need to come in immediately to see you. I talked with them about, what's going on. And the family had been notified that the photographs of her abuse had been found and taken off the internet, but there was no guarantee. And in fact, there was really a suggestion that this would be one of many phone calls that she would get throughout her life, notifying her that these images had been found and removed. We attempted again to engage in therapy using all of the skills that she already had. And unfortunately, we were far less successful. And the reality of that is because while the sexual abuse being a really horrific thing that happened to her, that was in the past, and she was able to conquer the memories of that experience in a way that framed it as something that she had survived and something that she could move past. The reality of these images was something that was going to be an ongoing trauma for potentially the rest of her life. And the reality that she may not know all the abusers who are going to engage with those photos in a way that is nefarious and again, abusive. And so it was far less successful for her to be able to overcome the beliefs and the reality of the situation. And so where we landed was continuing to use the coping skills that she had to move forward in her life, and to brace herself for the reality of this ongoing trauma. And that was her story. And I'm sad that it does happen so often for our children, and impacts them throughout their life.
Thank you, Carrie. It's not good enough that this material is allowed to continue surfacing, and that the tech companies in general are just invited to do something, but there's no accountability. This will change with the passage of the EARN Act. We'll conclude our first panel with an overview of the long-term suffering CSAM victims experience from Anthony Zarkness.
Hi, thank you. I'm Anthony Zenkus. I teach at Columbia University in the School of Social Work. Child sexual abuse and exploitation can leave impacts on the body and brain that last a lifetime. It's not just a trauma that occurs at the time of the crime. When we are exposed to any type of really toxic, stressful situation, like child sexual abuse, our fight or flight system kicks into gear. And when that happens, our heart rate goes up, our breathing changes, our brain becomes different, the way that it processes information. And that's to help us get out of a situation where that is dangerous or unsafe. But that trauma also leaves a very indelible imprint on our brains and our bodies. And it does that so it can keep us safe when in the future we may encounter something. So one of the things it does, this ancient stress response system evolved before we had language. So these trauma memories are often sensory, like colors, sights, shapes, sounds, temperatures, smells. And the thing is, throughout the lifespan, years later, one of those things can just trigger that exact same stress response the person had when they were being sexually abused at the age of 5 or 6. An example would be a 31-year-old person goes into a job interview, and 5 minutes into the interview, all of a sudden, their heart rate goes up. They feel like they're going to die. All of a sudden, their breath, they can't catch it. Their thoughts become disordered. They excuse themselves from the interview and they don't get the job. What that person didn't know is that the cologne that the person that was interviewing them that was wearing was the same cologne that the uncle who molested them when they were 9 years old wore. And it's not a thought in the front of our brains. It's that ancient stress response system that triggers. So having the trauma of sexual abuse can be debilitating throughout life. And one thing I want to show is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in 1998 did a landmark study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study. And what that showed is the more traumatic experiences a child has, the more likely they are to suffer from a whole bunch of negative health outcomes, including mental illness, depression, anxiety, addiction. It can make it more likely that the person has serious job problems or relationship problems, but it can even increase the likelihood of getting sick or dying from the 10 most preventable causes of disease and death in the United States, because trauma is an impact on the body as well as the brain. But I do want to say, and this is really important, that healing is possible. And with trauma-informed care, people are able to move beyond their traumatic experiences. The problem is, most people who've been sexually abused, and by the way, the latest research says that it's more than 1 in 10 children in the United States that are victims of sex abuse. Most people that are victims of sex abuse don't have images of themselves floating around on the internet. So for those that do, those victims of exploitation, that journey is 100 times harder. We cannot stand in their way of their healing. The healing is possible. People can live joyful lives, but we need to help them get there. And I do want to say that if somebody wants a deeper dive on this information, I'm happy to explain it, because it's hard to get into this. But please understand, the work we're doing today is so important. It changes lives. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Anthony. We're moving now to our second panel, and we'll take questions after panel 2 if time allows. So panel 2 is why the Earn It Act helps drive solutions. Yiota Souras is Senior Vice President and General Counsel at NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, created by Congress in 1984 to fight child abduction, sexual abuse, and exploitation. NCMEC knows more than any other U.S. entity the dimensions of sexual violence against children and why we need the Earn It Act. Yiota, why has NCMEC prioritized this bill?
Don, thanks so much. So as a little background, NCMEC, as Don said, is the congressionally designated clearinghouse and resource center on missing and exploited children issues. As part of our responsibilities as the clearinghouse on these issues, we operate the cyber tip line, which is the reporting mechanism for members of the public and online platforms to submit reports about child sexual exploitation. This will range from reports about child sexual abuse material, child sex trafficking, online enticement, and other sexual crimes against children that have an online component. The cyber tip line provides us with a unique view on the explosive growth of child sexual exploitation on the internet and helps explain why we need Congress's help now to address this horrific activity online. I'm going to go through just a few numbers to help explain what we're facing when we talk about online child sexual abuse. In 1998, when NCMEC first began the cyber tip line, we received 4,500 reports relating to child sexual exploitation. By 2014, we had reached over 1 million reports. Then the numbers really started to skyrocket. Just a year after we received 1 million reports for the first time, we received 4.4 million reports in 2015. The next year, that number almost doubled to 8.2 million. Just 4 years later, in 2020, that number nearly tripled to 21.7 million reports. And last year, we received over 29.3 million reports relating to child sexual exploitation. And these reports collectively contained over 85 million images, videos, and other content relating to child sexual abuse. Over the past year, NCMEC has averaged of receiving 80,000 cyber tip line reports every day relating to online sexual exploitation. And over the past 2 to 3 years, the volume of videos, sexually abusive videos that NCMEC receives has outpaced the number of images. The tremendous volume of reports may lead you to think that the system is working well to detect, report, and remove online child sexual exploitation. And some companies are undertaking extraordinary efforts to try to detect and remove content. But it's essential to keep in mind that 90% of the reports NCMEC receives are submitted by just 5 companies. Too many other companies are not using free available technology and voluntary initiatives to detect, report, and remove this content. Too many are not reporting information to the cyber tip line in a way that best helps identify and safeguard children. And too many are not responsive when survivors or advocates reach out to report CSAM online. At NCMEC, we're so appreciative that Congress recognizes the immense harm caused by online child sexual exploitation and has asked how it can help to address the problem. This year, the resounding answer to how to address the problem is passage of the EARN IT Act. In NCMEC's view, the EARN IT Act is the most comprehensive child protection bill to be introduced in years. This is not a bill about encryption, privacy, mandatory screening of online content, or any content protected by the First Amendment. As you heard in the first panel from Glen, child sexual abuse material is graphically and specifically defined as per se illegal content, and the bill is narrowly directed only to child sexual abuse material. Given NCMEC's broad clearinghouse responsibilities, it's rare that we actively lobby in favor of legislation. The EARN IT Act is a clear exception for us. The bill broadly advances child safety and also provides crucial support for survivors, as well as the actions undertaken by online platforms, law enforcement, NCMEC, and many other nonprofits to help detect, report, and remove CSAM. Just in closing, for any staffers or members of the media in the audience, I'd encourage you to reach out to NCMEC after the panel if you have questions about the bill, its importance to child safety, or if you'd like to talk about NCMEC's work collectively with online platforms, survivors, or nonprofit partners and law enforcement to combat online child safety. To combat online child sexual exploitation.
Thank you, Yiota. These are sobering statistics and a reminder of why, how tech has the ability, but we need accountability in order to move them. One of the first transnational advocacy groups created to confront child sexual abuse in all of its guises is ECPAT International. And we have Nina DeJonge, who serves right now as ECPAT-USA's Public Policy Director, which she joined after serving in the office of Representative Karen Bass. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you for the introduction, Dawn. As mentioned, my name is Nina DeJonge, and I'm the Policy Director at ECPAT-USA. First, I wanted to start this off by going back on what Glen had mentioned earlier about the terminology of using the phrase CSAM as opposed to child pornography. I think this is such an important distinction because language matters. The EARN It Act is important because it holds big tech accountable, plain and simple. Tech companies shouldn't be able to turn an eye to CSAM constantly being distributed on their platforms. We have the opportunity to change the future of safety for children on the internet by implementing this legislation. For too long, we have bared witness to the testimonies of survivors detailing the most unconscionable realities and experiences they have endured as a result of their exploitation online. As technology continues to advance, so does the internet and its capabilities. This means predators and individuals whose purpose is to exploit and harm children have become even more skilled in their tactics. This is why we need to employ more nuanced approaches to combating these horrific offenses. Disrupting potential harms of exploitation in CSAM will require a multidisciplinary approach, which is why EARN It is so critical, because it creates a commission that was mentioned earlier to establish best practices. So how far does this issue span? Let's be clear, CSAM and exploitation is a global issue, not just a domestic concern. We have the chance to influence policy worldwide and lead policy changes. For some background on what our network is doing, ECPAT-USA is a member of ECPAT International, a network of organizations in over 100 countries. Our ECPAT International network, in collaboration with Interpol and UNICEF, combine their efforts to assess the overall landscape and threat of CSAM by collecting children perspectives of online sexual exploitation and abuse in 13 countries in Southeast Asia and Eastern and Southern Africa. This report consists of face-to-face interviews with child welfare and protection personnel, hotline information, interviews from survivors, parents, caregivers, and the reports also assess the access to justice, another issue that remains a barrier in the United States when looking at these cases. One of the studies took place in Uganda, for example. Of the nationally representative sample of children who are online between ages of 12 and 17, 1 in 10 had been offered money or gifts in return for sexual images or videos of themselves. And this is reoccurring in the US as well. The results of these reports detail a harsh and ongoing concern. More importantly, it highlights the need for increased awareness and legislative action on behalf of governments, which is why the EARN It Act, passage of the EARN It Act, is essential. Organizations across the country, as you've heard here today, are diligently working to combat this issue from multiple angles, but there's still a lot of work to be done. One of the core pillars at ECPAT-USA is our educational initiatives. Our director over this department has strategically and expertly curated trainings geared specifically to online harms and usage for parents, teachers, and students. Through training, though, we've noticed that tech literacy is a barrier and/or a concern among families and people participating in these classes. For example, tech literacy ultimately meaning how to access, manage, navigate technology. I make this specific point because this in turn can place children at a disadvantage from being protected online if caregivers or parents might not be equipped with the necessary tools. And this is where ECPAT-USA is able to meet the need of offering training so parents are able to better understand harms and potential predators. What I'm getting at is training is undoubtedly important, but it won't solve all the problems. We can equip individuals with a slew of resources and tools, but we need big tech and Congress to do their part. Increased awareness with comprehensive legislation like EARN It Act makes for a safer internet. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic increased the already existing vulnerabilities for children across the country. The numbers only stand to increase without real action. We have the chance to take a stand and drive meaningful policy solutions. It is important that we remember these numbers are not merely just statistics and that they represent real people who have been exploited and victimized. We have the opportunity to pass legislation that truly serves survivors and at-risk individuals. It has been incredible to see all the advocates from across the country mobilize and push the needle forward on this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. So when the Earn It Act was first introduced in March 2020, Professor Mary Leary testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee as an expert regarding online sexual exploitation and childhood sexual assault. She's a former federal prosecutor. I hope Mary will mention how the Earn It Act of 2022 is in fact stronger than the bill introduced 2 years ago. Mary.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming and taking time out of your day to listen to us. I will mention that it was a very different bill back. This was right before COVID. Everything in the world was different, and this bill was very different. It's a much stronger bill now, and I would encourage any of you who you're considering this bill to read the bill that exists now, because the bill that exists now is an excellent piece of legislation. My job here as a professor is to give a couple of historical points and one legal point. Historically, I have found that the discussion around this bill, around Section 230, sets up as though Section 230, when it was created in 1996, was some sort of well thought out, well-planned piece of legislation that was designed from its inception to create the internet. Well, that's just not what it was. Section 230, as described by the Congressional Research Service, was, quote, part of a suite of measures to amend the Communications Act of 1934 in order to protect children on the internet. It was an amendment to the Communications Decency Act, so often a point overlooked. And in that act, Congress was looking at an unknown internet horizon, and they were concerned about the potential for an increased volume of sexually explicit material. And they sought, quote, to remove the disincentives to restrict children's access to this inappropriate online material. Even one of the authors of Section 230, Congressman Cox, stated within this context of child protection that limiting sexually explicit material, quote, to protect Good Samaritans from taking on liability for helping us solve this problem. So what happened? Well, as many of you know, what happened was there were two unrelated components of the Communications Decency Act, which the court struck down, finding that they were not defined clearly enough. They were ambiguous. Okay, but what happened is what was still standing was Section 230. And then it got hijacked. It got hijacked by ISPs who went into court arguing that and suggesting that Section 230 was this standalone concept, completely separating it from its original intent to be part of a larger constellation, or to be within a larger constellation of child protection. And the result, 2 decades of claiming this very limited immunity that existed for a very narrow purpose was actually what I've labeled a de facto absolute immunity, or practically a de facto absolute immunity, claiming that states couldn't enforce their own criminal laws, that victim survivors, like the people we've heard of on this call, couldn't sue them. And where do we arrive today? Congress's fears of what the internet could be, from what we heard from NCMEC, they have not only been realized, they have exceeded their greatest nightmare. And why? Because tech companies have turned Section 230 on its head and acted as though they are immune even when they harm children, which was the exact opposite of congressional intent, both with Section 230 as well as your intent with our other child pornography or CSAM laws. The Earn It Act, I would argue, actually restores Section 230 to your original intent in Congress as a component of an ecosystem that will better protect children. Second historical point I wanted to make really quickly is every time there is an amendment for Section 230, we hear the same arguments from tech. And I would encourage you to go back and look at your files for the letters that you receive. And for example, when the SAVE Act was proposed, you had tech companies and their surrogates writing how it would, quote, hurt small businesses, that users would lose content. You had these advocacy groups talk about how it would be removal of protected speech. Well, lo and behold, That didn't happen. And then with Sesta Fossa, you had these same groups write, quote, how it would, quote, spell disaster for innovation, that the modern internet is only possible without Section 230. Last time I checked, the internet's still working just fine. And Google itself said that a statutory clarification of Section 230, quote, would be a disaster for the internet. Well, last time I checked, their profits were showing the internet's working great. So I would suggest to you, when you see these arguments with regard to this piece of legislation, put them in the context in which they should be. And that is to say, we're warned of this every time common sense bipartisan legislation comes forward to address Section 230, and they don't come true. But what has come true is Congress's original concern back in 1996 that sexually explicit material could abound on the internet and harm our children. So that's why I would suggest the Earn It Act actually restores Section 230 to, or gets it closer to its intended purpose: narrow, limited immunity, not de facto absolute immunity.
Thank you, Mary. Our last panelist is probably the nation's best informed expert on what tech companies know and don't know, can and can't do when it comes to child sexual abuse documentation. Professor Hany Farid worked with a team to invent PhotoDNA, the hashing technology currently used by NCMEC, law enforcement, and some private companies to detect and eliminate criminal still images, not moving images. I'm eager to hear Professor Farid's thoughts on the Earn It Act.
Thank you, Don, and thank you for having me. And it's nice to be here with my fellow panelists. As you said, I've been in this space for a long time, and I've observed a few things. When it comes to addressing online harms, the technology sector has a pretty standard playbook, and it goes something like this. First, start by denying a problem exists. Second, admit the problem, but downplay its extent. Third, admit the extent of the problem, but claim that there's no solution to address it. 4, when presented with a technological solution, claim that the deployment of the technology would somehow be too burdensome or would lead to abuse. And lastly, after years of delay and harm, deploy a technology, albeit usually anemically, and then fail to adapt to new and emerging threats. For the past 2 decades, the technology sector as a whole has followed this basic playbook when it comes to tackling the global distribution of child sexual abuse material on their services. Despite being presented with evidence in early 2000, 20 years ago, of the then growing CSAM problem that you heard from NCMEC, the technology sector denied the nature of the problem and denied that solutions were possible. And so, as you mentioned just a minute ago, it wasn't until 2008 when I partnered with Microsoft that the first technology was developed and widely deployed to combat the global distribution of CSAM. This technology, PhotoDNA, is now in worldwide use. It's responsible for the vast majority of reports to NCMEC's cyber tip line, which you heard just a few minutes ago. It's used by the UK-based Internet Watch Foundation and has been incorporated into the highly successful Arachnid project run by the Canadian Center for Child Protection. Following up on what Mary was saying, I will say that when we were developing and deploying PhotoDNA, we heard these same alarmist responses. If you do this, you will destroy the internet. If you do this, it will lead to A, B, C, D, and the classic, what I consider intellectually lazy, slippery slope argument. And none of those things happen. And so you should, when you hear these alarmist responses, you should understand that history, as Mary was quite nicely saying. The decade-long global success of PhotoDNA stands in stark contrast to the many who argued that the technology couldn't be developed, or that once it was developed, it wouldn't work, or that it somehow would be abused. The titans of tech seem to have no limits when it comes to developing technologies that lead to phenomenal growth and profit, and yet seem impotent when it comes to addressing the weaponization of the services in the form of everything from CSAM to non-consensual intimate imagery, domestic and international terrorism, the distribution of illegal and deadly drugs, small and large-scale fraud, the spread of dangerous and deadly disinformation campaigns, and the litany of horrific things that happen on the internet every day. The argument that technologies are not able to address these harms is at odds with the past development and deployment of effective technologies that are either financially advantageous to the titans of tech or mandated by regulators. So for example, from the earliest days of Facebook and YouTube, they managed to largely keep adult pornography off their site. Despite the legality of the content, these platforms decided that adult content would be bad for business. And so they developed technology to effectively find and remove this content from their services, and they flourished. Similarly, when it comes to finding content that is maximally engaging to us, the social media giants have developed eerily precise personal recommendation algorithms that maximize user engagement. And on the regulatory side, the passage of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, online services have been reasonably effective at finding and removing copyright infringing material. After passage of the EU's GDPR and the German NetzDG regulation, the technology sector managed to find solutions despite their claims that the regulation would somehow be impossible to comply with or would be overly burdensome, and along the way, didn't destroy the internet. The past 2 decades have taught us that when it comes to growing their user base and profits or preserving their market dominance, the technology sector is unbounded in their creativity and innovation. And yet, despite clear evidence of their ability to do so when properly incentivized, when it comes to addressing the myriad of online harms that we face today, the technology sector hides behind disingenuous arguments and scare tactics to avoid simply investing in making their products safe. The limitations to creating a healthier and safer online space is not fundamentally technological in nature, but rather one simply of corporate prioritization of profits and growth over safety and the lack of proper incentives to do otherwise. While self-regulation might be the most desirable, the technology sector has proven over the past 2 decades that it is simply incapable of self-regulation. So the time has come to pass modest and sensible legislation that nudges the technology sector to focus some of their phenomenal resources, their talent, and their innovation to address the undisputed harms that arise from their services. We need not accept technologies that harm our citizens, often the most vulnerable among us. Instead, we can and we should create incentives that encourage the creation of safe and healthy online spaces while still allowing for innovation, openness, and privacy. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you, Hany. I'm gonna take 2 or 3 questions right now, and then we might be able to take some more afterwards. But first question, maybe Mary or Yiota, is can you explain how what in the Earn It Act, what it means if companies knowingly are aware of the CSAM on their site, the knowingly piece?
Sure. Thanks for that question, because that was the third point I didn't get to. So let me explain knowingly. There is one of the arguments you'll hear is, well, knowingly, that's confusing. The statute, the section 2252A, the federal civil statute that removing this de facto absolute immunity could open up an avenue to, requires that in order to be successful, a plaintiff would have to establish that the defendant acted knowingly. Knowingly is the second highest level of culpability in the criminal law. It's not negligence. It's not should have known. It's not even recklessness, which is pretty high. It is that they knowingly. There is no confusion in the law as to what that term means. And I invite anyone to come to my first year criminal law class, where in the first 2 weeks, we memorize this definition. Knowingly requires the actor to be practically certain his criminal conduct will cause the social harm. It is a very high burden for a victim survivor to be able to establish that an ISP acted knowingly with regard to his or her victimization. And so that is higher actually than some of us would like. I feel a reckless standard might be more appropriate. The Congress has chosen, the authors of this have chosen to act conservatively and put this high burden of culpability in order to have a claim against one of these companies.
Thank you. Yiota, another question I got is, how can we protect against CSAM without further harming already vulnerable adults who are active in the commercial sex trade?
So I think I would just underscore how very narrow this bill is, and the specific two statutes that are discussed in the actual bill are again very specific to child pornography. Child pornography, again, graphically, specifically defined. It is per se illegal conduct, and it has nothing to do with consensual adult, or sex worker activity whatsoever. So we're really talking about two entirely different planes. So again, the bill only addresses child pornography, which is the term that's used under the law currently, or child sexual abuse material, and that is something that is very far from any concerns that a sex worker or consensual adults would have.
Thank you. Okay, another question I'm seeing is some of the criticism is claiming that law enforcement agencies already have adequate investigatory tools to find CSAM and prosecute abusers. What do you say to that? Maybe Glen, you want to take that? I have stuff to say too. But.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, from a law enforcement perspective, this really isn't a law enforcement problem, right? So we need, I still refer to myself as law enforcement sometimes, we need the companies to do more so that law enforcement can really focus on the what we call high harm offenders, right? So right now, some law enforcement agents and officers can only go out of their office on a case if the abuse involves a child under 5, for example. So that tells us the extent of the problem, and that's why Earn It Act will make that voluntary arrangement and companies coming together, hopefully with this commission, so that it's not just a law enforcement problem, right? Law enforcement do have tools, and obviously law enforcement use tools like ours to proactively investigate these cases. But we really need more from the tech companies, and their clever technology, as Hany's already pointed out, their clever technology and their brains can help law enforcement solve this problem.
And I would add to that too, that a number of law enforcement agencies have endorsed the Earn It Act. They are also asking for it, saying that they need it. I haven't heard from a single actual individual working in law enforcement that this would harm their work, rather it just helps. So it's really coming from kind of the misinformation around the bill. We promised to conclude the briefing in a way that's respectful of everyone's busy schedules. There are a lot of questions about privacy and end-to-end encryption, but I think we really covered that strongly. This isn't about privacy. It really restores privacy for victims of the worst experiences of their lives. So we've covered a lot of that. I'm going to hand it over now for final words to two exceptional Senate subject matter experts. We have Collin Anderson, who's the tech policy advisor to Senator Richard Blumenthal, and Blair Bjellos, who is senior advisor to Senator Lindsey Graham.
Thanks so much, Dawn, and really appreciate NCOSE putting this wonderful briefing together and all of the incredible experts that were on the panel today. Thank you all so much. I think the experts have explained why this bill is so important and why it is critical that it becomes law as soon as possible. I would say the Earn It Act is the best kind of bill in that it's one where Republicans and Democrats have come together, groups from all across the political spectrum have come together to say this is incredibly important and we need to pass it. We need to protect children and we need to bring justice to victims of CSAM. It's clear why the bill is such a priority for my boss and for Senator Blumenthal and many other members of Congress. We are incredibly grateful to all of our co-sponsors, to the hundreds of organizations from across the country that support the bill. The bill, as many of you know, is being marked up in the Senate Judiciary Committee this Thursday, and we look forward to a unanimous vote once again.
It's hard to follow that, and it's hard to follow the panelists that have spoken so powerfully over the past hour. I was taking notes, and it really does seem to me like what we've heard is powerful evidence of an urgent need, the capability to act, and the real direct implication on human lives from a lack of accountability and a lack of action. And quite frankly, if we're being told that reform and accountability for such an area where there's such a nexus of opportunity and implications for people, if we're being told that that's impossible. I mean, I think I shudder to think about what else we're being told that we can't do. And so I really just, you know, I thank the witness, the panelists. I thank all of the supporters. We've had just such an immense grassroots effort behind this bill, which I think, you know, makes it possible, and I think is the livelihood that really, you know, motivates this effort. And so we really look forward to the markup on Thursday, and especially, you know, hopefully moving towards the floor and, you know, bringing this sort of accountability that will really change people's lives for the better.
Well, Collin and Blair, we thank you for your leadership. And I thank all of you panelists for joining with us today to educate the congressional offices as we move this way. Anthony, did you just raise your hand? Did you give me a thumbs up?
I gave you a thumbs up.
Okay. Well, everyone, take care.
Thank you.